Yes, I saw Katla, and then I don't know what happened next. I just sank into the black depths and didn't wake up until the thunderstorm passed and it was already beginning to lighten over the mountain tops. I was lying with my head on Jonathan's knee, and terror washed over me as soon as I remembered. There, far away, on the other side of the river, was where Katla had stood, on the high cliff over Karma Falls. I moaned when I remembered it, and Jonathan tried to comfort me. She isn't there any more, she's gone now. But I cried and asked him, how can something like Katla exist? Is it a monster, or what is it? Yes, she is a monster, said Jonathan, a dragon, risen from ancient times. That's what she is, and she's as cruel as Tinjil himself. Where did he get her? I asked. She came out of Katla Cavern. That's what some believe, said Jonathan. Down there she once fell asleep back in ancient times. She slept for thousands and thousands of years, and no one knew she existed. But one morning she woke up. A terrible morning. She came slithering into Tinjil's castle, blowing her deadly fire at everyone. They fell right and left wherever she went. Why didn't she kill Tinjil? I asked. Tinjil fled for his life through all of the castle's rooms. When she closed in, he pulled out his battle horn to call his soldiers for help, and when he blew the horn, what happened then? Then Katla came crawling to him like a dog, and since that day she obeys Tinjil, and only Tinjil. She is scared of his horn. When he blows it, she blindly obeys. It lightened more and more. The mountain top over in Carmanyaka glowed like Katla's fire, and Carmanyaka was where we were going. I was scared. Oh, how I was scared. Who knew where Katla was lying in wait? Where was she? Where did she live? Did she live in Katla Cavern? And how could Orvar be there? I asked Jonathan, and he told me how things were. Katla didn't live in Katla Cavern. She had never returned there after her ancient sleep. No Tinjil kept her chained in a cave near Karma Falls. In this cave she stood bound by a chain of gold, Jonathan said, and there she stayed except when Tinjil took her with him to strike terror in the people he wanted to terrorize. I saw her in Wild Rose Valley one time, said Jonathan. And then you screamed, I said. Yes, then I screamed, he said. Terror grew inside me. I'm so scared, Jonathan. Katla is coming to kill us. Again he tried to calm me, but she is chained. She can't go farther than her chains reach, no farther than the cliff where you saw her. She almost always stands there and stares down into Karma Falls. Why does she do that? I said. I don't know, said Jonathan. Maybe she is searching for Carm. Who is Carm? I asked. Oh, that's just Elfrida's talk, said Jonathan. No one has ever seen Carm. He doesn't exist, but Elfrida says that he lived in Karma Falls once in ancient times, and that Katla hated him then and could never forget it. That's why she stands there and stares. Who was he? How could he live in such a hellish falls? I asked. He was a monster too, said Jonathan. A serpent as long as the river is wide, Elfrida says, but it's just an old tale, you know. Maybe he's no more a story than Katla, I said. He didn't answer, but he said, do you know what Elfrida told me? While you were walking in the forest picking strawberries, she said that when she was little, they used to frighten children with Carm and Katla. The saga of the dragon in Katla Cavern and the serpent in Karma Falls. She heard it many times as a child and enjoyed it, just because it was so horrible. It was an old story that people have used to frighten children throughout time, Elfrida said. Couldn't Katla have stayed in her cavern then? I said, and just kept on being a story. "Well, that's what Elfrida thought too," said Jonathan. I shivered. It occurred to me that Carmagnaca was a land full of monsters, and I didn't want to be there. But I had to go there now. We fortified ourselves first with our provisions, though we saved something for Orvar to eat, because in Katla Cavern there was only starvation, Jonathan said. Grim and Fialar drank rainwater that had collected in the crevices. The pastures were poor for them to graze in up here in the mountains, but by the bridge a little grass grew, so I think they were fairly well satisfied when we left. And so we rode over the bridge toward Carmagnaca, Tinjil's land and the monster's land. I was so scared that I trembled. The serpent, I didn't seriously believe that he existed, but I still thought about him. What if he suddenly hurled himself up out of the chasm and pulled us down from the bridge to perish in Karma Falls? And Katla, I dreaded her most of all. Maybe she was waiting for us now on Tinjil's shore, with her cruel fangs and her deadly fire. Oh, how I was scared. But we went over the bridge, and I didn't see Katla. She wasn't standing on her cliff, and I said to Jonathan, "No, she isn't there." And yet she was there, not on the cliff, but her terrible head stuck out from behind a large stone next to the path up toward Tinjil's castle. Then we saw her, and she saw us, and then she let out a cry that could have torn down the mountain. A spray of fire and smoke poured out of her nostrils. She snorted with rage and pulled her chain, tugging and pulling and shrieking again. Grim and Fialar were terrified. We could hardly hold them, and my terror wasn't any less. I begged and asked Jonathan if we could turn back to Nangiala, but he said, "We can't fail Orvar. Don't be scared. Katla can't reach us, even though she tugs and pulls on her chain. Yet we must hurry," he said, because Katla's cries were a signal that would be heard up in Tinjil's castle, and soon there would be a swarm of Tinjil's soldiers all over us if we didn't make time to flee and hide in the mountains. And we rode on wretched, narrow, steep mountain trails. We rode so that sparks flew here and there among the rocks, to confuse any pursuers. Every minute I expected to hear horses galloping behind us, and shouts from Tinjil's soldiers, coming after us with spears and arrows and swords. But none came. It was probably hard to follow someone among the many cliffs and mountains in Carmagnaca. The hunted could easily escape here. We had ridden for a long time. I asked Jonathan, "Where are we going?" "To Katla Cavern, of course," he said. "We're almost there now. Katla Mountain is right in front of your nose." Well, so it was. In front of us was a low, flat mountain with steep slopes dropping straight down. Only in our direction they didn't drop off so steeply. We could easily make our way up if we wanted to, and we wanted to because we had to cross over the mountain, Jonathan said. "The entrance lies on the other side, out by the river," he said, "and I must see what is going on there." "Jonathan, do you really believe that we'll ever get inside Katla Cavern?" I said. He had told me about the huge copper door that closed off the entrance to the cave, and about Tinjil's men who stood on watch outside day and night. How in all the world would we get inside? He didn't answer that. He just said that now we would hide the horses, because they couldn't climb the mountain. We led them to a sheltered crevice right below Katla Mountain, and left them there, the horses and packs and everything. Jonathan petted Grim and said, "Wait here, we're only going out to investigate." I didn't like the idea of investigating, because I didn't want to be separate from Fialar, but it couldn't be helped. It took us a good while to reach the mountain plateau, and I was tired when we finally got there. Jonathan said that we could rest a little, and I immediately threw myself flat on the ground. Jonathan did too, and we lay there up on Katla Mountain, with the wide sky above us, and Kotla Cavern right below us. Yes, it was strange, I thought. Somewhere beneath us, inside the mountain, was that horrible cavern with all its passages and caves, where so many people had wasted away and died, and here outside butterflies fluttered around in the sunshine. The sky above us was blue with little white clouds, and around us were flowers and grass. It was strange. Flowers and grass grew on the roof of Kotla Cavern. It came to me that since so many people had died in Kotla Cavern, then Orvar might also be dead, and I asked Jonathan what he believed, but he didn't answer. He just lay there and stared up into the sky. He was thinking about something, I realized. At last he said, "If it's true that Kotla slept her ancient sleep in Kotla Cavern, how did she get out when she woke up? The copper door was already there then. Tinjil has always used Kotla Cavern as a prison. While Kotla lay asleep inside there," I said. "Yes, while Kotla lay asleep inside there," said Jonathan, "but no one knew it." I shivered. I couldn't imagine anything worse. Think of sitting imprisoned in Kotla Cavern and seeing a dragon creep right by. But Jonathan had other thoughts in his head. "She must have come out another way," he said, "and I must find that way, even if I have to look for a year." We couldn't rest long. Jonathan was uneasy. We were approaching Kotla Cavern. It was just a short walk over the mountain. We already saw the river far down below us and Nangiala on the other side. Oh, how I longed to be there. "Look, Jonathan," I said, "I see the willow tree where we swam, there on the other side of the river." It was like receiving a greeting from across the water, a small green greeting from the river bank. But Jonathan signaled to me to be quiet. He was afraid that someone would hear us. We were so close now. Kotla Mountain ended here with a vertical drop, and in the mountain wall below us was the copper door to Kotla Cavern. Jonathan said, although we couldn't see it from up here, but we could see the soldiers on guard. 3 of Tinjil's men. I only had to see their black helmets for my heart to begin thumping. We crept on our stomachs toward the slope so that we could peer down at them, and if they had peered up, they would have seen us. But there couldn't be more worthless guards. They did not look here or there. They just sat and played dice and didn't care about anything else. No enemy had ever penetrated through the copper door, so why should they keep watch? Just then we saw the door swing open down there, and someone came out of the cavern. One of Tinjil's men. He carried an empty food bowl, but he tossed it away from himself onto the ground. The door closed again behind him, and we heard it lock. "Well, now the swine's been fed for the last time," he said. The others laughed at that, and one of them said, "Does he know this is a special day, his last to live? Did you tell him that Kotla is waiting for him tonight when darkness falls?" "Yes, and do you know what he said then?" "Yes, at last," he said, and then he asked to send word to Wild Rose Valley. How did it go again? "Orvar may die, but freedom never." "Kiss me," said the other. "That's what he can say to Kotla tonight, and he'll get to hear her answer." I looked at Jonathan. He became pale. "Come," he said, "we must leave here." And we crept away from the slope as quietly and quickly as we could, and when we knew that we were out of sight, we ran. We ran the whole way back and didn't stop until we were with Grim and Filar again. We sat in the crevice with the horses because now we didn't know what we could do. Jonathan was so sad, and I couldn't do anything to comfort him. I could only be sad too. I knew how much he mourned for Orvar. He had believed that he could help him, and now he didn't think so anymore. "Orvar, my friend, whom I never got to meet," he said, "tonight you'll die, and what will happen to Nangiala's green valleys then?" We ate a little bread, which we shared with Grim and Filar. I wanted to have a few sips of goat milk too. We had some saved. "Not yet, Scotty," said Jonathan. "Tonight, when darkness has fallen, then I'll give you every drop, but not before." He sat there for a long time, so quiet, in poor spirits, but at last he said, "It's like searching for a needle in a haystack, I know, but we must still try." "Try what?" I asked. "To locate where Katla came out," he said, though he didn't believe in it himself, I noticed. "If we had a year," he said, "then maybe, but we only have a day." Just as he had said that, something happened. In the narrow crevice where we sat, some thick bushes grew along the far end of the mountain wall, and out of those bushes a terrified fox suddenly appeared. It slunk past us and was gone almost before we had seen it. "Where in the world did that fox come from?" said Jonathan. "I have to find out." He disappeared behind the bushes. I stayed put and waited, but he took such a long time and it was so quiet that finally I became worried. "Where are you, Jonathan?" I shouted. Then I definitely got an answer. He sounded very excited. "Do you know where the fox came from?" "From inside the mountain. Do you understand, Scotty? From inside Katla Mountain. There's a large cavern in there." Maybe everything was already predetermined in the sagas from ancient times. Maybe it had already been predetermined that Jonathan would rescue Orvar for the sake of Wild Rose Valley, and maybe a secret being from the saga guided our steps, but we didn't realize it. How else could Jonathan have found a way in the Katla cavern right where we had put our horses? It was just as strange as when I ended up at Matias's farm, among all the houses in Wild Rose Valley and no other place. Katla's passage out of Kata Cavern. This must be what Jonathan had found. We didn't think it could be anything else. It was a hole right through the mountain wall, not large at all, but big enough for a starving dragon to pass through, Jonathan said, if she woke after thousands of years and found her usual path closed off by the copper door. And big enough for us. I stared into the dark hole. How many sleeping dragons were in there? Do you think? Dragons who would wake up if you entered and happened to step on them. That's what I wondered. Then I felt Jonathan's arm around my shoulders. "Scotty," he said, "I don't know what waits there inside in the darkness, but I'm going in there now." "I will too," I said, though I knew my voice quavered a little. Jonathan touched my cheek with his finger, as he did sometimes. "Are you sure you wouldn't rather wait here with the horses?" "Haven't I said that wherever you go I'll follow?" I said. "Yes, you've said that," said Jonathan, and he sounded quite happy. "Because I want to be with you," I said, "even if it's a chasm in a land underground." Katla Cavern was such a chasm. Creeping through that black hole, it was like creeping through an evil, black dream you couldn't wake up from. It was like going from sunlight to perpetual night. All of Katla Cavern was nothing but an old, dead dragon's lair, I thought, still smoldering with evil from ancient times. Thousands of dragon eggs had probably hatched here, and cruel dragons crawled out like an army platoon to begin killing everyone that got in their way. An old dragon's lair. Tinjil would think it was suitable for a prison. I shivered when I thought of everything he had done to people inside here. I felt the air was thick with old, dried evil, and I heard strange whisperings in the midst of the horrible silence surrounding us. Far inside the cavern steps it whispered, and I felt that it was all the pain and all the tears and all the death that Katla Cavern had experienced under Tinjil's rule. I wanted to ask Jonathan if he also heard the whispering, but I let it be, because it was probably just my imagination. "Now, Scotty, we're going on a walk that you'll probably never forget," said Jonathan. And so it was. We had to cross through the entire mountain to reach the cave prison, just inside the copper door, where Orvar was. This was the cave folks meant when they spoke about Katla Cavern, Jonathan said, because they didn't know of any other cave, and we didn't know either if it was really possible to reach underground. But the way was long, we knew. We had wandered this stretch up the mountain before. It would be 7 times worse fumbling down here in the dark, winding passages without any light other than the torches we carried with us. Oh, it was horrible to watch the torchlight flickering along the cavern walls. It could only light up a little bit of the great darkness around us, and that's why everything outside the light felt even more dangerous. Who knows, I thought, maybe it was full of dragons and serpents and monsters lying in wait for us in their dark cave. I was also so scared that we would get lost in the winding passages, but Jonathan made black soot marks on the cavern walls with his torch as we went, so that we could find our way back. Walk, Jonathan said, but we didn't do much walking. We crept and crawled and climbed and swam, and jumped and scaled and struggled and slaved and more. That's what we did. What a walk, and what caves. Sometimes we came to caverns so large that we couldn't see the other end of them. We realized how huge the rooms were only from the echo. Sometimes we went where you couldn't stand up, but had to crawl on your stomach like any other dragon. Sometimes the way was blocked by an underground stream, which we had to swim to get across. And worse than anything else, sometimes gaping chasms opened in front of our feet. I almost fell down into one of these chasms. I was carrying the torch then, and I tripped. Jonathan grabbed me just as I would have gone down into the abyss, and that's what I happened to drop the torch. We saw it fall like a stream of fire, deeper and deeper and deeper, and at last it disappeared. And so we were in the darkness. It was utterly the worst darkness in all the world. I dared not move or talk or think. I tried to forget that I existed and that I stood there in the blackest darkness of all, next to a chasm. But I heard Jonathan's voice next to me. He finally lit the other torch we had with us. And meanwhile he talked to me, talked and talked quite calmly. That was why I didn't die from terror, I believe. And so we slaved on, how long I don't know, in the depths of Katla Cavern. You didn't know anything about time. It felt as if we'd wandered in there for an eternity, and I began to be scared that we wouldn't get there until it was too late. Maybe it was already nighttime. Maybe darkness had already fallen out there, and Orvar, maybe he was already with Katla now. I asked Jonathan if he thought so. I don't know, he said, but if you don't want to go crazy, don't think about it now. We came to a narrow winding passage that never wanted to end, and that just became narrower and tighter bit by bit. It shrunk both in height and width until you could hardly squeeze through any longer, and in the end it became just a hole. You had to crawl to get through it. But on the other side of the hole, suddenly we were in a large cavern. We didn't know how large it was, because the light up from the torch didn't reach far. But Jonathan tried out an echo. Ho, 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 he shouted, and we heard the echo answer, ho, 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 many times and from many directions. But then we heard something more, another voice far away in the darkness. Ho, 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 it copied. What do you want, you who enter here in such a strange way, with a torch and light? I'm searching for Orvar, said Jonathan. Orvar is here, said the voice, and who are you? I'm Jonathan Lionheart, said Jonathan, and with me is my brother, Carl Lionheart. We've come to rescue you, Orvar. Too late, said the voice, too late, but thanks in any case. He had hardly said that before we heard the copper door open with a crash. Jonathan threw down the torch and trampled it to put it out. Then we stood still and waited, and in through the door came one of Tingel's men with a lantern in his hand. I began to cry quietly to myself, not because I was scared, but for Orvar's sake. How could we have such rotten luck that they would come to take him right now? Orvar of Wild Rose Valley, get ready, said Tinjil's man. You'll meet Katla before too long. The black escorts are on the way. In the light from his lantern we saw a large wooden cage with thick timbers, and we realized that Orvar was held prisoner there like an animal. Tinjil's man put the lantern down on the ground, next to the cage. You may have a lantern during your last hour. Tinjil has decided this in all his grace, so that you'll become accustomed to the light again and can see Katla when you meet her. That's what you want, right? He bellowed with laughter, and then he disappeared, out through the doorway behind him. It closed again with a crash. By then we were already in front of the cage with Orvar, and we saw him in the light of the lantern. It was pitiful. He could hardly move, but he still crept up to the bars and stretched out his hands to us through the timbers. Jonathan Lionheart, he said, I heard much about you back home in Wild Rose Valley, and now you've come here. Yes, now I've come here, said Jonathan, and then I heard him crying a little, too, because of Orvar's misery. But then he pulled out a knife from his belt and went to work on the cage. Slash it, Scotty, help, he said, and I slashed my knife, too. Although what could we do with a pair of knives? We needed an axe and saw. But we cut with the knives until our hands became bloody. We cut and cried. We knew that we had arrived too late. Orvar knew it too, but maybe he wanted to think differently, that it wasn't true, because he was grunting with excitement inside his cage, and sometimes he mumbled, hurry, hurry. And we did, so that the blood ran. We cut wildly, and every moment we waited for the door to open and for the black escorts to come in, and then it would be the end for Orvar, and for us, and for all of Wild Rose Valley. They won't have only one to take away, I thought. Katla will get 3 tonight. I felt that I couldn't stand it any longer. My hands trembled so much that I could hardly hold the knife, and Jonathan shouted with rage. He was furious that the timbers wouldn't give, however much we slashed at them. He kicked at them, screamed, and kicked, and slashed again, and kicked again. And then finally there was a crash. Yes, finally one of the timbers snapped. And then one more. It was enough. Now, Orvar, now, said Jonathan, but he only got a gasp in reply. Then he crept inside the cage and dragged Orvar out. He couldn't stand or walk on his legs. I could hardly either at this point, but I staggered in front, shining the lantern, and Jonathan began dragging Orvar away toward our tunnel to safety. He was tired now, and he panted too. Well, all 3 of us panted like hunted animals, and that's how we felt too. At least I did. However he managed it, Jonathan succeeded in dragging Orvar across the entire cavern, and he succeeded in forcing him through the hole, and amazingly he was able to take Orvar with him, who was more dead than alive. I was almost too, and now it was my turn to crawl through the hole, but I never had time to get that far, because we heard the door creaking, and then it was as if I ran out of energy. I couldn't move at all. Quick, quick, the lantern, panted Jonathan, and I held it out to him, although my hands shook. The lantern needed to be hidden. The smallest stream of light would be enough to give us away. The black escorts, they were already inside the cavern now, and Tinjil's men too, with lanterns in their hands. They were so fearfully bright, but over in our corner it was dark, and Jonathan began to pull me out by the arms, and dragged me through the hole into the dark passage behind, and there we lay, all 3 panting, and we heard the cries, he's escaped, he's escaped. That night we carried Orvar through the underground. Jonathan did. He dragged Orvar through hell. It couldn't be called anything else. I was just able to drag myself, and hardly that. He's escaped, they cried, and when it became quiet we waited for pursuers, but they didn't come. Still, even Tinjil's men must have figured out that there was a hole to crawl through out of Katla Cavern. when we disappeared, and the hole couldn't be that hard to find. But they were cowards, Tinjil's men. They dared to attack an enemy as a pack, but none of them dared to crawl first into a narrow passage where an unknown enemy waited. No, it was because every single one of them was a coward. Why else would they allow us to escape so easily? No one had ever run away from Katla Cavern before, and how would they explain Orvar's escape to Tinjil? That's what I wondered, but that was their problem, Jonathan said. We had more than enough of our own. Not until we had dragged ourselves through the long narrow passage did we dare to stop and catch our breath for a while. It was necessary for Orvar's sake. Jonathan gave him goat milk that was sour and bread that was soggy. Still, Orvar said, "I've never had a better meal." Jonathan rubbed Orvar's legs for a while to bring life back to them, and he recovered a little, although he couldn't walk, just crawl. He learned from Jonathan which way we needed to travel, and Jonathan asked him if he still wanted to go farther that night. "Yes, yes, yes," said Orvar. "I will crawl on my knees home to Wild Rose Valley if I have to. I won't lie here calmly waiting for Tinjil's bloodhounds to come snarling after us in this passageway." It was already noticeable who he was, not a subdued prisoner, but a rebel and freedom fighter. Orvar of Wild Rose Valley. When I saw his eyes in the lantern's light, then I understood how Tinjil could be scared of him, even though he was still weak. He had some sort of fire burning inside, and it was probably thanks to this fire that he lived through our hellish night, because this had to have been the worst night in the world. It was as long as an eternity and full of terror, but when you become sufficiently tired, you don't have the energy to care about anything, not even if bloodhounds are coming. Yes, I certainly heard the hounds coming, growling and barking, but I didn't have the energy to be scared. Besides, soon it became quiet. Not one bloodhound dared go far into the chasm where we were crawling around. Far, far we crawled, and when we finally crawled out into the daylight, by Grim and Filar, broken and scraped and bloody and soaked to the skin, and as good as dead from exhaustion, night was over and morning already here. Orvar stretched out his arms. He wanted to hug the ground and the sky and everything he saw, but his arms fell down. He was already asleep. We sank into a deep slumber, all three, and knew nothing until it was almost evening. Then I woke. Filar pushed me with his nose. Surely he thought that I had slept long enough. Jonathan was also awake. "We must be out of Carmagnaca before it gets dark," he said, "or we won't find the way." He woke Orvar, and then Orvar came to life and sat up and looked around and remembered and understood that he was no longer in Katla Cavern. Tears came into his eyes. "Free," he mumbled, "free." And he took Jonathan's hands and held them for a long time in his. "You've given me back my life and my freedom," he said, and he thanked me too, though I hadn't done much but be in the way. Surely Orvar felt as I did when I was freed from my sickness and came to Cherry Valley, and I wished so much that he would also reach his valley, alive and free, but we weren't there yet. We were still in Carmagnaca's mountains, now probably teeming with Tinjil's soldiers, who were searching for him. It was only luck that they hadn't found us in our crevice while we slept. We sat there in our crevice and ate the last of our bread, and then and there Orvar said, "I'm alive, I'm free, and I live," because he had been the last prisoner still left alive in Katla Cavern. All the others, one after one, had been offered to Katla. "But you can rely on Tinjil," he said. "Believe me, he'll see to it that Katla Cavern won't stand empty for long. Again the tears came to his eyes. "Oh, my Wild Rose Valley," he said, "how long will you grieve under Tinjil?" He wanted to hear about everything that had happened in Nangiala's valleys during his imprisonment, about Sophia and about Matthias and about everything that Jonathan had done, and Jonathan told him. Also about Jossi. I almost thought Orvar would die in front of our eyes when he found out that it was because of Jossi that he had suffered for so long in Kotla Cavern. It was a long time before he was himself and could talk again, and then he said, "My life means nothing but what Jossi has done to Wild Rose Valley. For that he can never make amends or be forgiven. Forgiven or not, he's probably gotten his punishment by now," said Jonathan. "You'll never see Jossi again." But a fury had come over Orvar. He wanted to leave. It was as if he wanted to begin the freedom fight already, this evening, and he swore at his legs which carried him so poorly. Though he tried and at last succeeded in raising himself up, and he stood on them. He was proud when he could show us that, and he certainly was a sight as he stood there and swayed back and forth as if he would blow down. You had to smile when you saw him. "Orvar," said Jonathan, "anyone can tell from far away that you're a prisoner from Kotla Cavern." And it was true. We were bloody and dirty, all three, but Orvar was the worst. His clothes were in rags, and his face was hardly visible. Because of his beard and all his hair, you could only see his eyes, his intense burning eyes. A stream ran through our crevice, and there we washed away all the dirt and blood. Time after time I dipped my face in the water. It was wonderful. It felt like I was washing away all of Kotla Cavern. Then Orvar borrowed my knife and cut off much of his beard and hair, so that he looked a little less like an escaped prisoner, and from his pack Jonathan took the Tinjil helmet and cloak that had gotten him out of Wild Rose Valley. "Here, Orvar, put these on," he said. "Then maybe they'll believe that you're one of Tinjil's men who has taken 2 prisoners and are on your way with them somewhere." And Orvar pulled on the helmet and cloak, but he didn't like it. "This is the first and last time you'll see me in these clothes," he said. "They smell of oppression and cruelty." "They can smell how they like," said Jonathan, "if they can help you get home to Wild Rose Valley." It was time for us to leave now. In a few hours the sun would go down, and when it became dark in the mountains, no one could make their way on these dangerous paths. Jonathan looked serious. He knew what awaited us, and I heard what he said to Orvar. "I believe the next 2 hours will determine Wild Rose Valley's fate. Can you manage that long on horseback?" Yes, said Orvar, "for 10 hours if you like." How he would ride Fialar. Jonathan helped him up on the horse's back. Then he was an entirely different Orvar, almost as if he grew in the saddle and became strong. Yes, Orvar was brave and strong, just like Jonathan. I was the only one who wasn't brave at all. But when we had mounted, and I was sitting there, with my arms around Jonathan's waist and my forehead leaning against his back, it was as if a little of his strength flowed over me, and I wasn't so scared anymore. Still, I couldn't help thinking how nice it would be if we didn't always need to be strong and brave. If only we could be together again like the first days in Cherry Valley. Oh, it seemed so long ago now. Then we began our journey. We rode toward the sunset, toward the bridge in Carmanyaka's mountains. There were many paths, and they all looked the same. No one except Jonathan could have found the right way in this mess, but he found it some strange way, which was lucky for us. I searched for Tinjil's men until my eyes stung, but none appeared. Only Orvar rode behind us, wearing his horrible helmet and black cloak. My terror heightened every time I happened to turn my head and saw him. I had learned to be fearful of that helmet and everyone who wore them. We rode and rode, and nothing happened. It was so calm and serene and beautiful everywhere we went. A quiet evening in the mountains, you could call it, I thought. If only it weren't so wrong, how easily something could turn up in the quiet and stillness, and all we felt was an awful tension. Even Jonathan was worried and on watch every moment. If only we make it across the bridge, said Jonathan, then the worst will be over. How soon will we be there? I asked. Within a half an hour, if all goes well, said Jonathan. But then we saw them, a troop of Tyndale's men, 6 men with spears on black horses. They emerged where the trail curved around the mountain wall, and they came trotting right toward us. Now it's a matter of life or death, said Jonathan. Over here, Orvar. Orvar hastily rode up from behind us, and Jonathan threw the reins over to him so that we would look a little more like prisoners. They still hadn't noticed us, but it was too late to escape, and there was nowhere to escape. The only thing we could do was to ride on and hope that Orvar's cloak and helmet would fool them. I'll never be taken alive, said Orvar. I want you to know that, Lionheart. As calmly as we could, we rode toward our enemies. Closer and closer we went. My back tingled, and I had time to think that if we were caught now, we could have just as easily stayed in Katla Cavern and avoided being tormented during the long night to no avail. Then we met. They slowed down their horses to pass us on the narrow path. The one who rode in front was an old friend. It was none other than Park. But Park didn't look at us. He only looked at Orvar, and just as they rode past each other, he asked, Have you heard if they've found him yet? No, I haven't heard anything, said Orvar. Where are you going? Asked Park. I have a few prisoners, said Orvar, and he didn't tell Park anything more. Then we rode on, just as quick as we dared. Turn around carefully, Scotty, and see what they're doing, said Jonathan, and I did as he said. They're riding away, I said. Thank goodness, said Jonathan, but he rejoiced too soon, because now I saw that they had stopped, and were all looking back at us. They've started thinking, said Jonathan, and evidently they had. Stop for a minute, shouted Park. Listen, I want to take a closer look at you and your prisoners. Orvar clenched his teeth. Ride on, Jonathan, he said, or we're dead. And we rode. Then Park and the whole troop turned. Yes, they turned around and set out after us, the manes of their horses flowing. Now, Grim, show them what you can do, said Jonathan, and you too, my Filar. I thought and just wished that I had gotten to ride him. There were no better sprinters than Grim and Filar. Oh, how they flew along the path. They knew it was now a matter of life and death. Our pursuers were after us. We heard thundering hooves, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but persevering, never becoming silent, because now Park knew whom he was hunting, and none of Tyndale's men could let such a quarry slip away. They would be quite something to haul back to Tyndale in his castle. We had them at our heels as we galloped over the bridge, and a pair of spears were thrown at us, but they didn't reach us. Now we were over on the Nangiala side, and the worst should be over, Jonathan had said, but on the contrary, I didn't notice it. The witch hunt continued farther along the river. High up onto the bank, the riding trail turned leading toward Wild Rose Valley, and we sprinted there. We had traveled by here on another summer night. It easily seemed like 1,000 years ago now, when we had come riding along at dusk, Jonathan and I slowly riding on the way to our first campfire. That's how you should travel by the river, not like now, so that the horses were almost drooping. dropping. Orvar rode the wildest because now he was riding home to Wild Rose Valley. Jonathan couldn't stay with him, and Park was gaining on us too. I couldn't understand why until it finally dawned on me it was my fault. There wasn't a swifter rider than Jonathan. No one could reach him if he were alone on a horse, but now he had to think of me all the time, and it hindered him. This ride would determine the fate of Wild Rose Valley, Jonathan had said, and I would determine how it would end, which was horrible. More and more I felt that it would end badly. Every time I turned around and looked back, the black helmets had come a little closer to us. Sometimes they were obscured behind a hill or trees, but then relentlessly they were there again, nearer and nearer. Jonathan knew as well as I did now that we couldn't save ourselves, not both of us, and it was necessary for Jonathan to escape. I couldn't let him be captured for my sake. That's what I said. Jonathan, do what I say now. Let me down behind the bend when they won't see it and catch up to Orvar. He was astonished at first, I noticed, but not as amazed as I was myself. Do you really want to risk it? Asked Jonathan. No, but I still will, I said. Brave little Scotty, he said. I'll come back and get you as soon as I have Orvar safely at home with Matthias. I'll come. You promise? I said. Yes, what do you think? He said. Then we had reached the willow tree where we went swimming, and I said, I'll hide in our tree, return for me there. I didn't have time to say more, because now we were sheltered behind a hill, and Jonathan reined in his horse so that I could slide off. Then he sped off again. And I quickly rolled aside down into a hollow. I lay there and heard our pursuers thunder past. I caught a quick glimpse of Park's stupid face. He was gnashing his teeth as if he were ready to bite, and Jonathan had saved his life. But now Jonathan had already caught up with Orvar. I saw them disappear together, and I was very satisfied. Ride, little Park, I thought. If you think it'll help, Orvar and Jonathan will never see you again. I stayed in the hollow until Park and his men were also out of sight. Then I scurried down to the river and to my tree. It was pleasant to crawl up into its green top and sit in the fork of a branch, because I was tired now. A little rowboat lay there and bumped against the bank by the tree. It must have pulled loose from somewhere farther upstream, because it wasn't moored. Whoever had lost it was probably sad now, I thought. Well, I sat there and thought a little bit about everything, and looked around me. I saw the rushing water and Park's Rock. The coward should be sitting out there, I thought, and so I looked at Katla Mountain on the other side of the river and wondered how anyone could imprison another person in her horrible cavern. I thought about Orvar and Jonathan too, and hoped so badly that they would escape to our underground passage before Park caught them. And I wondered what Matthias would say when he found Orvar inside the hideout, how happy he would be then. All of that is what I thought about, but it began to get dark, and now it occurred to me for the first time that I might be there the whole night. Jonathan wouldn't come back before it got dark. It was a little eerie. Anxiety came crawling over me. At the same time, dusk was falling, and I felt lonely. Then suddenly I saw a woman on horseback up on the river bank, and it was none other than Sophia. Indeed it was Sophia. I've never been so happy to see her than just then. Sophia, I cried. Sophia, here I am. And I crept out of the trees and waved my arms, but it took some time before I could make her understand that it was really me. Oh, Carl, she shouted. How did you get here, and where is Jonathan? Wait, we are coming down to you. We still need to water our horses. And then I saw two men behind her, also on horseback. I recognized the first one. It was Hubbard. The other was hidden, but then he rode forward a little, and I saw him. It was Jossie, but it couldn't be Jossie. I thought that I might have gone crazy and was seeing things. Sophia couldn't have come here with Jossie. What had gone wrong? Was Sophia crazy too, or had I just dreamed that Jossie was a traitor? No, I hadn't dreamed it. He was a traitor. And I wasn't looking at a vision. Here he came, and what would happen now? Help, what would happen now? He came riding down to the river in the twilight, and he shouted from far away, "Well, to see little Kyle Lionheart, we meet again." They came, all three. I stood still down by the water, and waited for them with just one thought in my head. Help, what will happen now? They jumped off their horses, and Sophia came running over and took me in her arms. She was happy, her eyes were shining. "Are you out hunting wolves again?" said Hubbard, and he laughed, but I stood there silently and just stared. "Where are you going?" I managed to get out at last. "Jossie's going to show us where we can best break through the wall," said Sophia. "When the day of our battle arrives, we must know this." "Yes, we must," said Jossie. "We must have a clear plan before we attack." I was raging inside. At least you have a clear plan, I thought. I knew why he was there now. He wanted to lure Sophia and Hubbard into a trap. He would drag them straight into destruction if no one stopped him, but someone must stop him, I thought, and then I understood. Help, I must be the one to do it, and it couldn't wait. It must be done right now. I still didn't like this idea, but I had to do it now. But how would I begin? "Sophia, how is Bianca feeling?" I asked at last. Then Sophia looked sad. "Bianca never came back from Wild Rose Valley," she said. "But do you know anything about Jonathan?" She didn't want to talk about Bianca, but I found out what I wanted to know. Bianca was dead. That was why Sophia could come here with Jossie. She had never gotten our message. Jossie also wanted to hear if I knew anything about Jonathan. He must never have been caught, he said. "No, he wasn't," I said, and looked at Jossie straight in the eyes. "He's just rescued Orvar from Kotla Cavern." Then Jossie's rosy face became pale and silent, but Sophia and Hubbard cheered. Oh, how they cheered! Sophia hugged me again, and Hubbard said, "That's the best news you could have given us." They wanted to know how it all happened, but not Jossie. He was in a hurry now. "We can hear about it later," he said. "We must get to where we're going before darkness falls." Yes, because Tinjil's soldiers must already lie waiting, I thought. "Come, Carl," said Sophia. "We'll ride together on my horse, you and I." "No," I said, "you shouldn't ride anywhere with that traitor." I pointed to Jossie, and I thought he would kill me. He grabbed me by the neck with his big hands and hissed, "What are you saying? One more word and I'll smack you." Sophia got him to release me, but she wasn't happy with me. "Carl, it's awful to call someone a traitor when it isn't true, but you're too little to understand what you've just said." And Hubbard, he laughed a little. "I thought I was the traitor. I know too much and like white horses. What was it that you wrote on the kitchen wall back at home?" "Yes, Carl, you're throwing out accusations in every direction," said Sophia sternly. "You need to stop." "I ask for your forgiveness, Hubbard," I said. "Well, what about Jossie?" said Sophia. "I won't ask for forgiveness for calling a traitor, I said, but I couldn't get them to believe me. It was terrible. When I realized it, they wanted to follow Jossie. They were bringing about their own misfortune, but I still tried to stand up to them. "He's luring you into a trap," I shouted. I know it. Ask him about Vetter and Cater, whom he used to meet up on the mountain, and ask him what he did when he betrayed Orvar." Jossie wanted to rush at me again, but he restrained himself. "Can we get going?" he said, "or should we risk everything just because of this boy's lies?" He gave me a look full of hatred. "And I liked you at one time," he said. "At one time I liked you too," I said. I could see how scared he was underneath his fury. He was really in a hurry now. He needed to have Sophia captured and imprisoned before she learned the truth, or else it could be a matter of life and death to him. What a relief it must have been to him that Sophia didn't want to know the truth. She relied on Jossie as she had always done, and at first I had accused one and then another. Why should she believe me? "Come now, Carl," she said. "I will straighten this out with you later." "There will be no later if you follow Jossie," I said. And then I cried. Nangiala couldn't afford to lose Sophia, and here I stood and I couldn't save her, because she didn't want to be saved. "Come now, Carl," she said again, persistently, but just then I remembered something. "Jossie," I said, "open your shirt and show them what you have on your chest." Jossie's face went white. Even Sophia and Hubbard must have noticed it, and he laid his hand over his chest as if he wanted to hide something. It was quiet for a moment, but then Hubbard said with a gruff voice, "Jossie, do as the boy says." Sophia stood in silence and looked at Jossie for a long time, but he turned his eyes away. "We have to hurry," he said, and he wanted to go to his horse. Sophia's eyes hardened. "Not so fast," she said. "I'm your leader, Jossie. Show me your chest." It was terrible to watch Jossie then. He stood there and gasped, unable to move and frightened, and he didn't know if he should run or stay. Sophia went up to him, but he knocked her out of the way with his elbow. He shouldn't have done that. She grasped him firmly and tore open his shirt, and there on his chest was Katla's mark, a dragon's head, and it glistened like blood. Then Sophia became even more pale than Jossie. "Traitor," she said, "you shall be cursed for what you've done to Nangiala's valleys." At last Jossie came to life. He swore and rushed toward his horse, but Hubbard was already there and barred his way. Then he turned and searched wildly for another way to escape, and he saw the rowboat. With a single leap he was down in it, and before Sophia and Hubbard could even make it to the bank, the current carried him beyond reach. Then he laughed, and a horrible laugh it was. "I'll punish you, Sophia," he shouted. "When I'm chief of Cherry Valley, I'll punish you severely." "You miserable fool, you're never coming back to Cherry Valley," I thought. "You're going to Karma Falls and nowhere else." He tried to row, but the furious, whirling waves slashed at the boat and threw it amongst themselves to crush it. They tore the oars from him, and then a raging wave came, knocking him down into the water. Then I cried and wanted to save him, even though he was a traitor, but I knew there was no way to rescue Jossie. It was so terrible and so sad to stand there in the darkness, watching and knowing that Jossie was completely alone and helpless out there among the swirling waves. We saw him come up at once on top of a wave, then he sank again, and we saw him no more. It was almost dark now, and the river of ancient rivers took Jossie and carried him toward Karma Falls.